Hey everyone, and welcome back to Malaysia in Focus, where we do deep dives into the social, political, and economic stories shaping our nation today. Because behind today's massive headline lies a much deeper truth about humanity, the law, and survival, a truth we haven't quite faced yet. Today, we're unpacking a highly debated and deeply complex reality right here at home, the situation surrounding Rohingya refugees. So, let's just dive straight in. For the longest time, Malaysia was seen as this beacon of hope for people fleeing absolute persecution, right? We welcome them. But if you've been paying attention to the social climate over the last couple of years, you've probably noticed a really drastic shift. We're going to explore exactly how that initial, genuine empathy for a persecuted group somehow got totally overshadowed by systemic friction, serious economic stress, and intense online hostility. How did we go from shared solidarity to demanding deportations? Let's trace it back. To really grasp the sheer scale of this, we've got to look at the numbers. 105,870. Just let that sink in for a second. As of September 2022, there were well over 100,000 registered Rohingya asylum seekers and refugees here in Malaysia. That is actually more than half of the entire UNHCR registered refugee population in the country. And get this, researchers point out that this doesn't even include the tens of thousands who are unregistered, just living totally under the radar. So we aren't talking about a small, isolated issue here. This involves a massive community living right alongside us in our cities and our neighborhoods. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to break this down step by step. First, a nation divided. Then, the journey to Malaysia. After that, the legal vacuum. Then we'll look at survival in the shadows, the pandemic tipping point, and finally, finding a path forward. Starting off with part one, a nation divided, from shared struggle to deep strain. Historically, a lot of folks in our Muslim-majority nation looked at the plight of the Rohingya and saw a shared Islamic struggle. There was this really profound sympathy. But as these urban settlements started to grow and basically became permanent fixtures in our society, that early solidarity really started to fracture under the weight of everyday reality. Moving on to part two, the journey to Malaysia, fleeing decades of persecution. To really understand why over 100,000 Rohingya are here today, we literally have to look back at decades of state-sponsored violence and the stripping of citizenship in Myanmar's Rakhine state. It definitely wasn't just a sudden influx. It's a very long, tragic history. This timeline here is super crucial because it proves this wasn't just a one-off event. Back in the early 1980s, you start seeing severe state violence and discrimination. Then, the 1982 Burma Citizenship Law essentially stripped the Rohingya of their citizenship, making them completely stateless in their own home country. By 1991, massive waves, we're talking over 250,000 people, began fleeing into Bangladesh. Fast forward to 2012, and horrific ethnic violence in Rakhine State displaces another 140,000. And all of this culminated in that absolutely heartbreaking 2015 Andaman Sea boat crisis, where thousands of desperate people were just stranded on the open water with barely any food or water. Entire generations forced to make these desperate escapes by land and sea, literally just to survive. If you look at the trafficking routes mapped across the Andaman Sea here, it's pretty chilling. Drawn by our relatively stronger economy, our Muslim-majority population, and the established Rohingya networks that were already here, so many people endured these terrifying journeys. They crammed onto illegal smugglers' boats, navigating incredibly dangerous human trafficking routes across the Bay of Bengal and the Andaman Sea. A lot of them first entered through places like Langkawi Island before making the really long trek down to major urban centers like KL, Penang, and Johor. When you look at the data between 2012 and 2016, Malaysia was shouldering one of the absolute heaviest burdens of displacement in the entire Southeast Asian region. Look at those numbers. We took in over 112,000 refugees during that peak. Out of a sense of genuine concern and basic humanity, the Malaysian government allowed them to stay temporarily, basically protecting them from being immediately expelled. But, as we're about to see, the definition of temporary ended up stretching out into a very, very long time. Which brings us to part three. The legal vacuum, the root of the systemic friction. This right here is where the structural flaw really kicks in. It's an underlying legal black hole in our system that makes true integration for these refugees basically impossible. The core of the issue is a massive legal blind spot. Because Malaysia never actually signed the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, our main immigration law, the Immigration Act 1959/63, literally does not recognize the word refugee. What does that mean in practice? It means a person fleeing an actual genocide is legally classified the exact same way as an undocumented economic migrant, or what we call a pati. It's kind of like rushing into an emergency room with a critical injury, but being treated as a trespasser just because you didn't book an appointment. Under Section 35 of the Act, they can be arrested without a warrant just for physically being here. They are essentially locked out of society by pure bureaucracy. Now this legal blind spot is exactly the root of so much of the friction we see today. If this breakdown is giving you a clearer picture of what's really going on, hit like and subscribe so you'll always stay ahead on Malaysia's biggest issues. Be part of an informed community and don't miss out on our future deep dives. All right, let's step into part 4, survival in the shadows, life as an undocumented person. Because they have zero legal recognition, it creates a domino effect on absolutely every single aspect of daily life, forcing the Rohingya into a highly vulnerable shadow economy. Think about what it really means to be totally barred from formal employment. You still gotta eat, right? Without the legal right to work, the Rohingya are pushed entirely into the low-wage informal sector. They become the folks cutting the grass, helping out at the wet markets, or working on construction sites, doing those 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and difficult. And because they have absolutely no legal standing, they face constant threats every single day. The research points to super high risks of unpaid wages, getting fired for no reason, and systemic extortion. We're talking about having to pay bribes anywhere from 100 to 7,000 ringgit just to avoid getting arrested. Oh, and the kids? They have zero access to formal government schools, so they rely entirely on these underfunded informal community learning centers. So the reality is, even just trying to survive becomes a massive risk. Let's look at healthcare. A 2001 Ministry of Health circular literally requires government healthcare workers to report any undocumented persons, and yes, that includes refugees and little kids, straight to the police. Imagine being absolutely terrified to take your sick child to a clinic because seeing a doctor might mean getting arrested and thrown into an immigration detention center indefinitely. It creates this huge barrier to basic health literacy and care, which, to be completely honest, ends up affecting the health security of the entire nation. Which leads us to part 5, the pandemic tipping point, when anxiety ignited hostility. Tensions from this super unsustainable situation had been bubbling under the surface for years, but the strict COVID-19 lockdowns in 2020 acted as this massive, dramatic catalyst. It turned all that underlying economic anxiety into explosive, open hostility. Let's unpack how this blew up into a full-blown crisis. We all remember the MCO lockdowns. Businesses were shutting down, unemployment was hitting record highs, and people were genuinely terrified for their livelihoods and their families. Right in the middle of all this intense national stress, a completely fabricated piece of fake news went viral. It falsely claimed that a Rohingya activist was demanding Malaysian citizenship and equal voting rights. Even though it was debunked pretty quickly, it acted like a lit match dropped straight into a powder keg of resentment. Almost overnight, social media platforms turned into these massive echo chambers for intense xenophobia. Trending hashtags like "Say No to Rohingya" were spreading like wildfire. Posts heavily scapegoated the refugees, painting them as unhygienic, a public nuisance, and a massive drain on heavily subsidized public resources. There were even circulating videos showing informal Rohingya workers being harassed on the streets just for being outside during the lockdown. Keep in mind, as daily wage earners, staying home for them meant absolute starvation. Data from the Malaysia Racial Discrimination Report clearly shows that xenophobia spiked incredibly dramatically during this specific time.
We essentially witnessed a complete 180 in public sentiment. Before 2020, there was a lot of humanitarian empathy. The public viewed the Rohingya through a lens of shared religious solidarity and basic human rights. But after 2020, total shift to intense securitization. A community that was once embraced by Malaysians was suddenly heavily surveilled. Online petitions were racking up hundreds of thousands of signatures, demanding their immediate deportation. Now, citizens understandably wanted priority during a huge national crisis, but the resulting narrative made an already marginalized group completely expendable. Neighborhoods and local wet markets practically turned into zones of domestic border control.
So, we arrive at our final section, finding a path forward, breaking the limbo. How in the world do we navigate our way out of this deeply entrenched, super complex situation without sacrificing the welfare and security of everyday Malaysian citizens? Because just sweeping it under the rug clearly isn't working for anybody. Researchers and policy experts are actually suggesting a highly pragmatic approach, one that balances our national interests with basic human rights. Number 1, increasing health literacy and allowing basic, safe access to equitable healthcare. This prevents the uncontrolled spread of diseases, which ultimately benefits the public health of everyone. Number 2, providing formal education access for refugee children. This ensures we don't accidentally create this permanently marginalized, unemployable underclass that might eventually turn to crime just out of pure desperation. And number 3, Malaysia simply cannot carry this weight alone. Think of it like a leak in your neighborhood. If only one house is out there trying to mop up the water, they're eventually going to drown. We urgently need comprehensive regional ASEAN cooperation so that our neighboring countries step up and share this regional burden fairly. Thanks so much for watching. Join thousands of Malaysians who want clarity, not confusion. Top like, hit subscribe, and let's keep making sense of these complex issues together. Ultimately, leaving hundreds of thousands of people in this permanent legal limbo is a status quo that is simply unsustainable. It doesn't work for our economy, it doesn't work for our security, and it doesn't work for our society. So it leaves us with one final vital question to ponder. Can Malaysia find a way to strictly balance its national security with a sustainable, humane solution for the stateless? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so let me know in the comments below. Catch you in the next explainer.